Deep night stood over the city on the mountain plain. At this time, the swindler was tied to chairs and gazed ahead with a nervous look. Lloyd sat with folded hands opposite the swindler with a distant expression. Then the brown-haired man waved his hand with a grin and asked the swindler not to be scared. The con man stared eagerly at the protagonist, who stated that when life is in danger, people tend to be selfish and they will do anything when they get the chance. The protagonist sat across from him, smiling, leaning on his hands, and remarked that cutting off his head would be too harsh. The con man suggested that they were ready to pardon him, but he received a sarcastic reply that his secret would be taken to the grave. Lloyd grinned lively, closing his eyes and resting his head on his fingers, asking the swindler if he was thankful to him because if so, why not return all the money? The con man began to smirk with a mocking grin and said that first, he needed to be forgiven. The protagonist continued to look at him with a smile, closed his eyes and said that he would receive mercy because that was the purpose of their existence. The man raised his eyebrows and looked at the protagonist in shock, then totally thrilled, exclaimed when the protagonist began to pull out a piece of paper and said that he would have one more condition. The brown-haired man, smiling, handed over a piece of paper and a pen so that the swindler would simply sign the agreement and the matter would be settled. The swindler, at this time, looked closely at the piece of paper and tried to understand what kind of contract it was. As it turned out, it was a standard work contract, and he would even earn money for it. The brown-haired man continued to smile, resting his chin on his finger, and said that 80% of his wages would be taken to pay off the debt. The protagonist crossed his arms and, with a teasing smile, said that in 520 years he would be able to clear it. The swindler's eyes widened in horror and his mouth dropped open. Xavier looked angrily at the grinning protagonist and realized that he should not have expected anything else because he came here not to sympathize and forgive. The brown-haired man continued to twist his smile in a cruel manner, and he did not consider himself a fool to kill someone who owed him money because he would definitely not make such a hasty step. Then the brown-haired man brought the tube to the swindler's head and began to press it because he said that he would drain all the value out of him until the end of his worthless life. The swindler immediately shouted eagerly because he was curious why he offered him such a harsh contract. The main character looked at him in surprise and realized that the swindler had now begun to talk differently. The main character stared at him intently with angry eyes, said that they had no choice but to force him to sign this agreement by force and resolve this issue in court. The swindler immediately began to sign this contract with tears in his eyes. White clouds floated in the sky at this time. The cart was carrying the guys along a forest path. The main character was riding in the cart with the knight and the swindler. Xavier held the blade on his shoulder and said that he managed to get some cash from it because it was enough to cover the interest for a couple of months. Lloyd did not understand what was being discussed because he was going to use all this money for building, as they had already been through this, and 30 workers were not enough. The main character, with an annoyed smirk, leaned his hands on the cart when Xavier explained that someone from the villagers had to reply to their job ad or his reputation would suffer. It was a mountain range on a plain where there were fields. A couple of days later, in the estate of the main character, there was a sign that workers were needed, where the pay was 20 gold, and for information, they should contact the Baron's estate. A whole crowd of people stood in line at the table in front of the Baron. Xavier stood next to the Baron, who assumed that all these people must dislike him, to which Xavier wanted to share his opinion. The blue-haired knight closed his eyes and said that Lloyd had promised to install the heating system on time and at a low cost, punish the betrayer of the estate, and forced him to appear before the highest court. Xavier looked down on the Baron and realized that he wanted to be seen as a trustworthy person who could be relied upon. The brown-haired man's eyes widened in shock, realizing that it was quite easy. The guy approached the counter where the Baron was sitting and asked him about the job. Lloyd replied that he only needed to sign the agreement. The main character's eyes widened in slight surprise when they wanted to show their gratitude to him. The brunette with a red scarf around his neck, smiling, stretched out his hands and said that his child caught a cold very easily as soon as it got a bit chilly. But thanks to the young master and his system, he had nothing to worry about this year. The brown-haired man looked in surprise at the bow of the man who thanked him. Lloyd immediately smiled brightly, his eyes wide, and he felt relieved. Although he was just trying to satisfy his ambition, he felt somehow uneasy. Then the Baron looked at this guy, who informed him that he had relatives from the Racona estate, which was nearby, and they wanted to know if he could install his system there too. The brown-haired man's eyes widened in confusion, and he realized that this was the first step to success. He immediately grinned. The bloodthirstiest had only one goal. The brown-haired man, continuing to smirk mockingly, extended his index finger. The blue-haired knight imagined the unfinished row. The protagonist stood with his knight on the edge of the mountain, looking into the vast distance. The knight looked at the smirking grin of the gentleman, who said that sooner or later there would be nothing left on this mountain. Lloyd continued to grin through his bangs and said that the heating system required a lot of materials, and soon only stumps would remain from the trees here. Xavier frowned in confusion through his bangs. The knight held his blade behind his back and understood that if the gentleman knew the outcome, then why did he continue to do this? Lloyd replied that this was exactly why he was stopping the construction of the Appin Road. It was a deep trench leading up the mountain because he wanted to start mining coal. The main character tossed the shovel behind his head and began to smirk wickedly because he wanted to sell this coal at a high price. And as soon as the whole of their system reached the masses, people simply would not be able to resist such a lure. Xavier looked angrily at the smirking gentleman, who said that their residents would receive a discount, but a very small one, and considered it unfair. Lloyd looked closely at the unhappy knight and asked whether he really thought him so cruel. The protagonist kept his eyes on his knight and asked what would happen if he gave up on this idea, hinting that then they would hardly be able to pay off the debt for the estate. The blue-haired guy continued to look at the protagonist with displeasure. He immediately closed his eyes, holding the blade, and said that he would agree that now they had no other choice. Then Xavier looked at the protagonist again and said that the Baron did not know about coal, and when he found out, he would not let it go so easily. Then he again smirked wickedly from under his brows and said that he would succeed. He imagined a huge technological drilling rig in the ground and said that thanks to modern tools for excavation work, he would succeed because he knew the shield method of digging. The brown-haired man immediately raised the shovel over his head with joy and said that great things awaited them, but Xavier did not understand this technology unknown to him. At this time, a joyful Lloyd tossed the shovel over his shoulder and walked forward because Xavier wanted to see what this completely different gentleman could do. It was the same destroyed tunnel littered with stones. This trench stretched straight to the entrance of the cave, which was blocked with stones. It was a deeper than cave. An ant's paw appeared, then the antenna of an ant appeared. A bunch of red eyes peered out of the darkness. They were angry, bloodthirsty ants. These were large ants that crowded in this cave. Time clapped his hands. He began to spin the magical green ring with a star with his hands, using spells. He then raised the ring above his head and emitted a green beam of light into the sky, hoping to call forth a high-class apartment for himself. The green beam of light stretched far into the night sky. Then the beam quickly vanished into a sparkling star. Suddenly a huge house appeared with this beam of light. He wished he had such an awesome ability. He sat at the table and barely emitted green light into the sketch, releasing green from his finger, attempting to complete the sketch because it took too much time. A notice appeared that this was a mid-level design, an underground outlet plan. He instantly leaned back in his chair and boldly declared that he wanted to summon 100 immortal workers who did not need payment. Then he placed his hands on the sketch again and began to finish it. Thanks to the Newman event, he was able to gain 639 RP, making a strong impression on the Baron, Baroness, Xavier, and others. It was a chart of the level system with basic measurements and design because he spent points on boosting his skills. He managed to obtain them. He stood on a rocky trail near a fallen cave because he understood that they would be digging here. He looked forward with his green grid sight because it was an available mid-level ability, the underground scanning dimension. He scanned the entire area of the cave with green light and saw a chamber there. Because this ability only allows you to view at a distance of 5 meters, it will help you find the correct path. Then, he stood with a confused expression, touching his chin with his hand and trying to figure out how to bore a passage in the shortest time. Because an ordinary person cannot do this, and besides, people tire quickly. At this time, Padong was fast asleep under the blanket and became sick while building the road. Even if he recovers, it will be risky to use it because it is too large. The main character looked around through his bangs with frustration and realized that he had no other option. A window appeared in front of him with a random choice of a mystical creature that he had enough points for. He was sitting on the trail, legs crossed, when a green light of arrival began to glow in front of him. It was a green portal from which a figure with a bow emerged. A snake girl with a bow on her head slithered out of this portal. This pink snake flopped down on the rocky trail in front of the owner. This pink snake gazed at the protagonist with awe. The protagonist stared at her with confusion and assumed that at least she had venom, but she turned out to be entirely harmless. But Padong also seemed like that at first, and perhaps this snake will be helpful. The brown-haired man sat with his arms crossed and looked at the small pink snake, asking if she truly grows in size after eating a sunflower seed and if she also has special powers, to which he received a positive reply. Lloyd smiled and extended his hand and asked to show the snake all its skills. This pink creature with closed eyes grinned widely. A few weeks later, this trail led to a tunnel under construction in a cave. This snake was chained in a wooden barrel and dug a tunnel, eating the dirt because the giant bell was moving inside the shield barrel. Then this pink snake chewed the dirt because it was called a bell and had the skill of digging the earth, level 1. At this time, the main character, with a worn-out look, stretched out his hand while the huge bell slithered nearby and told Xavier to prepare. At this time, the bear knight, in a sweaty state, held the sword in front of him. Then the bell released hot streams of metal from its opening. The knight at this time swung his sword to knock down the flying metal bars. Meanwhile, the other blacksmith workers were attempting to forge a sturdy support on the forge. Step 5 was the realization of the harsh truth, as Xavier, with a sad look, thought about why a knight like him should deal with the remains of a giant snake. Then Lloyd, with a towel around his neck, raised his hand and began to yell for the guys to keep working. At this time, the workers were pushing a wooden barrel into the depths of the cave, moving toward the target. Lloyd wiped his face from sweat, looking at the empty tube, because due to the lack of air, his head was spinning, and if they had not brought the tube here, they would have fainted long ago. Then, the brown-haired man looked at the knight behind him, who said that it was time for them to pause because, like the other workers, he needed to rest. Lloyd turned his head and said that he was in charge here and should oversee the progress of the work, as a responsible person usually does. He looked through his long bangs with an annoyed expression and realized that in Korea, the bosses only know how to speak, and there are even such rogues who have never visited the workplace. So he swore to himself that he would never become like that and would oversee the entire process himself. Then he used his vision scanning. He looked at the wall and saw a chamber with a green light where there were pieces of coal. He immediately picked up the shovel and began to celebrate with the rest of the workers that they were almost there, and there was still a little left. Then Lloyd looked with a grin at the bell that was pressed to his face, and he thanked them for the fact that they did it many times quicker. Then Lloyd looked back at the crowd of workers and his knight, giving an order that as soon as they reached the coal seam, they should dismantle the shield and enlarge the space. He looked at his workers near the stone wall and said that this was a rather dangerous task, so everyone needed to be extremely cautious. Then he looked back at the hole in the wall, hearing a strange noise. He continued to stare at this layer of dirt, listening to various sounds. He gazed at the layer of dirt with the other workers and realized that the dirt cover here was solid and should not collapse. Then he began to look forward with a close underground scan with a green light. With this scan, in the green chamber, he saw a crack in the wall and realized that it was not there before. He continued to watch this crack, seeing that it was expanding. Suddenly, a huge bloodthirsty ant broke through the wall. Lloyd fell to the ground when the ant was about to strike him. The knight immediately grabbed his sword and was about to save his master. He swung his sword, looking at the bloodthirsty beast. Lloyd also did not want to stay aside and ran with his shovel. He delivered a crushing hit to the monster's head with the tool. With just one strike of the shovel, he flattened the ant's head. He looked at the body with a fierce look, sweating, and realized that this was an incredible thing because something had appeared that was not mentioned in the novel. Then the knight, together with the main character, looked into a huge hole from where the black eyes of the other monsters appeared. These insects, with a bloodthirsty stare, began to crawl in all directions. Lloyd immediately waved his hand at his workers, who began to flee in terror to the exit. At this time, Lloyd swung his sword and sliced all the monsters. The main character, with an angry expression baring his teeth, tried to understand how many monsters were here because if they escaped, they were doomed. Xavier, out of breath, drew his sword, and Lloyd relied on him, but there was too little air here. At this time, the rest of the workers ran out of the mine, and he realized that it could not be destroyed without explosives. But even if the structure collapsed, there was a chance that the monsters would crawl out, and he tried to figure out what to do. At this time, Xavier slapped his master so that he would pull himself together and not panic. Then, The enraged protagonist looked at the fighting knight and said that he did not panic, but thought. The angry knight looked back and said that he would not be able to hold back the monsters for long. The brown-haired man held his shovel tightly, baring his teeth and thinking about what to do here with a tunnel, ants, coal, and a dungeon. It was an ordinary light bulb in a black space. Then, this light bulb began to emit streams of sparks in all directions above the protagonist's head. Lloyd immediately grabbed the torch on the wall. He took his shovel and torch and shouted to the knight that they needed to move forward to attack. The blue-haired knight continued to grin fiercely and realized that it sounded insane, but he ran to attack. Xavier then swiftly cut all the ant bodies with his sword, because he realized that there was a purpose in this. The main character, bloodthirstily, ran to attack with his torch together with the knight. From the palace came screams that there was terrible news for the Baron. Arcus opened his mouth in horror, hearing about the mutant ants and trying to understand where his son was. He immediately opened his armor cabinet, and the assistant said that all the workers were successfully evacuated, but Sir Xavier was still there, and the Baron would soon seal the entrance to the mine. Arcus immediately began to put on his armor and wanted to hurry, tightening his belt. Xavier, the fiercest of knights, held the blade in front of him, looking back with anger, trying to grasp why there were more and more ants. The protagonist at this time held a torch and shouted that now was not the moment for talking because he was very occupied. They stood back to back and fought off the mutant ants from all sides because he understood that it was fortunate that they did not come out of their holes, but the situation itself was very dreadful. The knight bowed his head and battled with fury because he was almost at his limit and did not care that it was hot here and there was little air, but there were many ants. At this time, the protagonist angrily showed his teeth, using his scanning vision because he was attempting to find methane in the dungeon. They continued to combat the ants, standing next to each other in the cave. He understood that coal was a place where methanogens were spreading, and because of this, layers of methane gas were hidden under all the mineral veins. He pulled out his burning torch and tried to figure out if he could only locate it, he would destroy all the ants. Then he looked closely at his knight behind him with his scan. He looked at the ground and saw a piece of a layer of methane gas. He immediately stuck his shovel into the ground and was about to dig. He spread his legs wide and began to excavate the ground, looking back at the knight and giving him the order to hold off the creatures. He immediately began to furiously dig the ground quickly. At this time, a huge ant tried to attack him. Xavier at this time swung his blade while Lloyd was digging. Xavier at this time dealt with the rest of the creatures, cutting the air around with his blade. He cut down the monsters, protecting the master. They immediately covered their ears from the loud earthquake and noise. A huge man appeared. The guys raised their heads in horror and realized that it was the queen ant. This huge creature immediately began to attack the guys. At this time, the brown-haired guy and the knight held their weapons and stared intently at the creature. Lloyd tried to ask his fighter if he could defeat her, to which he received a refusal. The brown-haired guy ironically said that if he did not attempt, he would not know, although Xavier understood that there were things that he could not do, even if he tried. The blue-haired guy put the blade behind his head and said that at the moment, they still had no other option. The queen ant furiously flew to attack. The knight immediately raised his blade, and a blue core began to grow above it. He immediately attacked the belly of the queen creature with his blade. This fierce ant immediately fell into a stupor. The knight thrust the tip of his blade into the creature's belly, then he waved his weapon away from the creature. At this time, the brown-haired man continued to furiously excavate the ground and understood that there was no time to waste, so he wanted his knight to hold out longer. At this time, the blue-haired knight swung his blade, fighting off the attack of the fierce queen of creatures. He stuck his shovel into the hole, and a stream of gas was heard from there. The brown-haired man immediately showed his teeth angrily in confusion. Lloyd immediately ran to his torch to grab it and told his fighter to run faster to the entrance. They began to flee from the cave, and the creature was chasing them. It was a grim cave where the chopped parts of the creatures lay, because they noticed a narrow passage that they had already used. The knight ran after the protagonist, who was holding a torch in his hands. Then our hero looked back, trying to throw the torch away. He immediately released a fiery torch toward the hole. This torch first hit the head and then flew off the ant. The fiery torch continued to fly into the depths of the cave, bouncing off the ground. The queen of creatures was about to finish off the prostrate main character. This flow of gas from the ground began to intensify. Suddenly, the entire space of the cave began to be enveloped in fire. A powerful fiery explosion occurred. The knight covered the master with his body when the explosion occurred. The ants watched the growing fiery explosion. It was a powerful surge of fiery energy. The knight continued to press the protagonist to the ground, protecting him with his body. At this time, Arcus, along with other knights and assistants, stood at the entrance to the mine there and tried to hold Arcus, who was about to run in armor to save his son. After the explosion, the battered Xavier continued to press Lloyd with his body. The brown-haired man at this time held his ears, grimacing. Then he began to get up, looking at the fallen Queen Ant, and realized that his plan worked. Then he looked closely at the lying knight and realized that he protected him. Then he picked up the pink snake and apologized to it for being in such a state. Then he looked up at the entrance. He saw that their entrance was completely blocked. He began to get up, leaning his hand on the shovel, and his ears were ringing. A notification popped up that there was a lack of oxygen. He looked ahead with his scanning vision in displeasure. He again saw the entrance with the help of scanning and realized that he needed to dig through faster. But he also had to dig more than 5 meters. A bar with the oxygen level appeared, which was already running out. He stuck the shovel into the ground and was about to dig because they had no other way out. At this time, the battered Xavier raised his gaze with his cloudy vision. He saw Lloyd digging the ground and shouting that they should get out together. The knight continued to lose consciousness and barely saw Lloyd's silhouette, who wanted to save them all. Then the blue-haired knight fell unconscious, hanging his head. A notification from the system appeared, which admired his act of not abandoning the knight. A notification popped up that Xavier's opinion of him had increased by +6, received 108 RP, accumulated 157. The completely out-of-breath protagonist tried to catch his breath in the sweat of his brow, a notification with an oxygen level that was already on the edge. He understood that he had nothing more to lose, and the oxygen level had noticeably decreased. The brown-haired man threw the shovel behind his head and frowned in the sweat of his brow, turning to the system because he wanted to find a search for knowledge that could improve skills. The system overload appeared. The main character stood with a furious look in the blue circle of the system. A message popped up that knowledge was detected in the absorption of the surrounding mana. It was a bunch of pop-up notifications whereby combining these abilities, he would be able to master the technique of the Azran core. He grinned wickedly, raising his fist, and was happy that he had not quit training since the duel with Nu, and would be able to improve his skill as he wished. His system asked in the window whether he wanted to learn this technique, and he agreed. He spread his legs wide and started to soak up the blue color because he had gained the skill of the aura. A glimmer of blue appeared in space. This ray of light began to swirl in space. His gray silhouette looked calm when the beam of light wrapped around his heart, and he felt it all, but sadly he did not have mana in his heart. But he could sense the presence of rings. A notification that mana had grown by 120% appeared. He slightly pursed his lips and realized that if he were a normal person, even if he trained hard, he might not get the result right away. But he had RP. A window with the Azran core technique popped up where he was going to boost the level in one click. He quickly pressed the increased skill key with his finger and inserted everything. He spread his legs wide again, began to study the blue light because he had raised the level of the core technique. A notification that mana had expanded by 125% appeared. Then he again wanted to raise the level and press the matching key. He angrily continued to boost his level by pressing the key, but he tried to figure out if he would need these points later. But now he had no choice and would level up as long as he could. Out of breath, he stretched his finger to the system window, wanting to level up. Rays of blue light filled the space. With them, the protagonist looked at the ongoing technique of the dual ring core in surprise, and the mana increased by 200%. A message that 100 points were needed before raising the next level appeared, but he only had 7 left. He bared his teeth with a ragged look and tried to figure out how things were now and whether the number of rings had grown. A window appeared where he had an available skill, and he couldn't help but feel tired for 10 minutes. 2 messages with an available skill. An energy burst where there was an expansion of mana, which will increase by 3 times for 20 seconds, appeared. He fiercely grabbed his shovel, baring his teeth and wanting to go further. He raised the shovel over his head with a savage expression and emitted light sparks into the entire space. He began to dig even harder at a quick pace. A message about the oxygen level, which was almost running out, appeared. The protagonist bared his teeth with a furious look and really wanted to see the flow of oxygen with the help of scanning. He saw a room and wanted to find just a tiny opening because if he could only find a crack, he would be able to breathe. He continued to dig the ground with his shovel, creating a cave. After a moment, he had already dug out a big part of the cave. A red message about the oxygen level nearing 0 appeared. He stared ahead with a sharp gaze. With the help of scanning, he saw a hole in the wall and saw an exit. Screams and sounds from excavations were heard from the cave. At this time, the knight lay unconscious along with the pink snake. Lloyd continued to fiercely dig the tunnel. A red message about the oxygen level already running out appeared. The protagonist opened his mouth wide, wanting to find a way out. That same red notification that the oxygen was already gone appeared. With the help of scanning, he saw this hole, which was about 3 meters away. He fell to his knees. He also dropped his shovel. He was sitting on his knees with a hopeless look because the effect of the skills had stopped. While Aver and the snake lay unconscious, Lloyd was sitting on his knees. He quickly thought about the release of energy, grabbed the shovel again, and jumped up with a savage look. He began to dig the ground again with a fierce look. With the help of scanning, he almost reached the hole because there was very little left for it. A notification of the oxygen level, which was completely over, appeared. The main character fell to the ground unconscious. Everything ended fast. He lay on the ground with a half-dead look and realized that as the son of a nobleman living in a faraway area, he only dreamed of a calm, quiet life. Then he closed his eyes. He lay on his stomach on the ground near the shovel. Suddenly there was a sound. The brown-haired man slightly opened his eyes, frantically tried to look, staring at the cave, hearing the sounds. Suddenly Padong burst through the hole in the ground with a happy look. Lloyd, with a joyful look, bulged his eyes with a smile. He quickly opened his mouth wide and began to breathe fresh air. Then, with the help of a shovel, he was going to stand up and understood that a peaceful life was definitely waiting for him. The night's blue moon lit up the mountain plain. A hot torch was in the cave. Arcas, along with the rest of the fighters, went inside with the help of torches. Bayan walked next to him and said that it was risky to go further, but the Baron asked everyone to go back, and he himself would go to the end. Arcas stared ahead with a torch. He saw 2 silhouettes when his son carried a knight. The protagonist, with a weary look, carried his loyal comrade on his back. A message popped up that using exceptional abilities in an emergency had helped him surpass the limits of human ability, and the special case, coupled with the skill of Aizen's core technique, had a strong effect on him. A notification with the available skill of the power mode, even when he was greatly tired, traces of the core technique could still have an effect. Arcas quickly dropped the torch and ran to his son. The protagonist, looking exhausted, carried the body of the unconscious knight. The brown-haired man and the unconscious knight fell into Arcas's arms. A large blue moon was visible through the black clouds. It was the next morning at dawn in a flat town. A man in a suit carried a wooden box, looked back at the janitor and said that he thought this young gentleman was a fool, but it turned out that this was not the case. The sun's rays lit up the houses of the town, and the man said that his nephew was in the middle of things. He saw everything himself when the giant ants attacked. The master's first thought was to save the workers, and the rumors were true. It was a busy street in the town when these guys talked to each other and said that Lloyd and the knight stayed in the mine, and they heard that they killed all the monsters. Then the main character carried the knight on his shoulders. The rising sun wrapped around the flat town, and they realized that this guy was different from the same Lloyd they knew. At this time, the knight was sitting on a chair in front of the protagonist, who was lying on the bed. Lloyd was lying on a pillow with his eyes closed. Then he began to open his eyes. Xavier quickly exclaimed. A notification that the people of their estate were deeply impressed by his brave actions and did not stop praising him appeared. The main character looked at the status window with a half-dead look. A system message popped up that he would be rewarded with extra points for outstanding achievements, and his balance was filled to 507. The main character quickly raised his eyebrows in surprise and realized that he had become a hero. Then he looked ahead with a smile. A white rocky path led to a cave. The workers continued to rebuild and construct it. Then they began to look around in surprise. They saw that the main character entered the cave with a knight. The workers immediately began to bow before them and greeted them for their merits. The worker looked at his savior with an admiring look and a gloomy grin because he was different from other nobility and was a true example of honor. The brown-haired man, with a downcast look and an ironic smile, felt awkward. A burning torch lit the cave because 2 weeks had passed since the ant incident, and work in the stone mine was in full swing. The brown-haired man walked with a torch into the narrow gorge of the cave because, in such a troubled time, their safety should come first, and he should avoid even the slightest chance of danger. The 2 of them walked into the caves with torches, and the knight said that today they were searching for ant trails and wanted to ask a question. Lloyd replied that there was no point in wasting breath on the matter and wanted to quickly talk. The protagonist looked back at the knight behind him, who asked why he himself constantly exposed himself to danger because he could just order others to do it for him. Xavier looked closely at the gentleman and realized that it could not be that he was interested in the safety of ordinary workers, and said that he, as the future heir to the estate, should be more careful. The knight looked at the back of the brown-haired man who walked in front and called him a fool. The protagonist continued to walk forward with his shovel torch and stated that he must, so it is, to bear responsibility for all possible risks. Xavier was slightly surprised. Lloyd looked at him mockingly, looked back, and said that in this case, even if he throws money around, no one will dare to say anything to him. Xavier continued to look at the protagonist with confusion and tried to understand whether it was good or bad. A notification that the level of his sympathy for him was about to increase, but he suddenly changed his mind. The two of them came to a dead end in the cave and realized that it was worth looking in another place. Still, the brown-haired man tried to look around with his scanning vision and realized that there was a hollow space. He immediately began to dig the ground, and Xavier realized that he wanted to make sure of this personally because this is where the queen could lay her eggs, and if the eggs did not hatch later, then they must destroy them. The main character made his way into a new space in a narrow gorge. He saw tied piglets in an orc tied with a web. They entered a cave where the domestic animals were completely covered in webs, and there was also a green orc. The knight immediately wanted to grab his blade, but Lloyd calmed him down because he did not see any threat here. Surprisingly, he was acting recklessly now. It was a green orc girl, and Xavier tried to understand what kind of creature it was. The main character came closer and held out a torch, assuming that the monster could die. The knight explained that this was unlikely because he had heard that ants prefer to keep their prey, having previously paralyzed it. The brown-haired man immediately smiled wickedly, spreading into a wide, sarcastic grin. He realized that this was an amazing find. Then they were transferred to the palace again. It was a rescued orc named Haraj, who stated that Lloyd was his savior, and he would never forget his deed. This orc was sitting on the bed in front of the protagonist, who was sitting on a chair opposite and trying to understand his accent, which he could use for his character. Haraj turned out to be the son of the chieftain of the orc tribe, and thanks to the care of the healer, he recovered very quickly. Haraj came with a fist to his chest and declared that he was the son of the chieftain of the Steel Sand tribe and would never forget the kindness of the main character and would give him everything he wanted. The protagonist, with a mocking grin, touched his chin and realized that he saved this guy for personal gain. They immediately leaned toward each other. The brown-haired man with a spreading smile asked the orc to call a bunch of his comrades to help the mines. The green man looked at him with confusion and refused. The protagonist slightly drooped and was shocked. Then Lloyd smiled again and tried to understand the reason. The green man replied that the guy just clicked his tongue and looked like a bad person, but Lloyd said that it was just a habit. Haraj pointed at himself and said that they were fighters and fighters only followed orders from their commander. The protagonist crossed his arms in puzzlement and thought that this was a problem because he was not considered a fighter, which meant he could not order them around. The protagonist imagined a strong orc with a severed ant head. He noted that he had heard that orcs, upon reaching adulthood, must go into the wild and bring back the head of a giant ant. But Haraj made the mistake of going to the ant lair, where he was immediately immobilized. Lloyd pressed his lips together. He then began to lick them with his tongue. The protagonist smiled widely, clapping his hands. He said that nothing could be done, congratulating Haraj on his coming of age. The orc looked down with a sad look. He said that he failed his task and did not catch the giant ant, and he could not move and fell. Lloyd asked what he was talking about. The protagonist pointed to the head of the huge ant with a wide smile. He asked the orc if they had not caught it together. The orc looked at the ant's head with puzzlement, saying that he did not remember catching such a huge ant. The brown-haired man said that of course he did not remember anything because he was unconscious, after which the guy put his hand on the orc's shoulder, looking at him with a serious look. He noted that he had witnessed a truly impressive sight, and when he reached the lair he saw the queen shaking with fear. Lloyd looked at Haraj with a cold look. He stated that the queen screamed that she did not believe that she had lost to the young orc. Haraj asked if this was true, and that the ant monsters understood their speech. Lloyd noted that they had succeeded in this quite well. Xavier looked at the protagonist in confusion. The protagonist said that, thanks to him, it was much easier to find their lair. The protagonist approached the orc from behind. after which he looked at him from the other side, saying that in general, they caught that giant ant together. The protagonist and the orc looked at the ant's head in surprise. Lloyd looked at Haraj with a wide smile, saying that he was an unmatched warrior, and Lloyd too. Haraj looked at the hero in puzzlement, saying about an unmatched warrior. The hero narrowed his eyes sarcastically, asking him about 120 orcs. The orc looked at the protagonist with confidence, clenching his hand into a fist, noting that they were his. White clouds floated above the mountains. A week later there were tents among the mountains, the village of the Steel Sand Orc tribe. Lloyd noted that this was how their long journey in search of labor ended. Aku sat on the throne, looking at you with a serious look. He told Lloyd that he was very sorry, but they would not be able to fulfill his request. The protagonist looked at the orc in shock, wondering why he was backing out. The protagonist smiled in puzzlement, pressing his hand to his chest. He turned to the great chief of the Steel Sand tribe, Aku, asking if he could know the reason for his refusal. The chief closed his eyes, saying that they were not strong enough to complete this task, and in order to maintain their strength they needed to eat meat, and if they did not hunt, their muscles would weaken. Behind the chieftain stood a sad Haraj. Aku said that losing their strength would lead to the fall of the tribe, and they could not reduce the number of warriors since they were needed for hunting. The protagonist asked if they hunt every day. Aku looked down at the protagonist, saying that this was true and their muscles would weaken if they did not eat meat. The protagonist thought that he was an idiot with his muscles. Xavier looked at the thoughtful protagonist, saying that for them, proteins and muscles are the meaning of life, and it would be better to abandon this idea. Lloyd slightly opened his mouth, saying that he heard them. Then he spread his arms out to the sides, asking if the meat did not spoil for several days. Then they would not have to hunt constantly, and they could lend them workers. The chieftain nodded his head, saying that everything was right and they wanted to pay him back. But when it came to their strength, Lloyd moved his leg to the side, asking what it meant. It was possible. The protagonist leaned slightly, smiling contentedly. He asked the chief, what if they had the ability to keep the meat fresh for a while? The protagonist noted that they needed to go back a little and remember the time when they first arrived at the village. Father's ties, Akash, with tears in his eyes, met his son, Herak. Suddenly, Herak rushed toward the chief. Aku bounced off the ground, heading toward his son. The father and son ran toward each other, after which they hugged each other tightly. A huge wave of energy came from their collision. The protagonist narrowed his eyes in confusion, watching what was happening. He noted that it was just a hug, but the effect was so destructive that if he stood between them, he would have been crushed into dust. The protagonist grinned slyly, thinking that if you could gather 120 of these brave workers, their output would increase 1,000 times. Lloyd noticed that there was something else worth attention. Herak showed his father a huge ant head, telling him to look, as he had brought the head of the queen ant. The orcs began to raise their fists in the air. The chieftain shouted to his son that he was proud of him and that this day would be a celebration. The orcs began to squat with objects on their shoulders, saying that they were just practicing. The brown-haired man watched what was happening in confusion. A golden pillar was visible on the orc's shoulders. The protagonist looked at the pillar in shock, wondering what they were doing with these shiny objects. The orcs were training with golden items. Lloyd noted that it felt like they were pulling them out of nowhere. An orc was clutching a golden lamp in his hand. The protagonist remarked that these items were more costly than any other sports gear. The protagonist grinned mischievously, holding a shovel in his hands. He stated that this was why he signed a deal with the chieftain for the building project, so they would gain both workers and riches. Xavier looked at the piece of paper carefully. He said that they would construct a stone-cold storage, and in return, they would receive all sorts of valuable trinkets, but they would need special tools to work with stone. The blue-haired guy looked at the protagonist curiously, asking what kind of stone-cold storage this was. He thought that he had never heard of such a thing. The protagonist pictured a stone structure. Lloyd asked the guy if he knew that the royal mages could keep food fresh using ice magic, noting that the cold storage was a building where he could do the same thing, only without magic. Xavier looked at the protagonist warily, asking how he knew all this. The brown-haired man said that he heard it from the group. The guy asked what a group was. The main character said that he was too idle to explain, asking why he knew so little. After that, he pointed his hand at the rock, saying that they would need a special kind of stone for the refrigerator, granite. It is very sturdy. The guys looked at the rock, Xavier noted that something told him that it would not be simple to get it. Lloyd agreed that this was true, and it would not be easy. The protagonist pursed his lips, thinking that they did not have dynamite either, but they had a great substitute. The brown-haired man looked at the blue-haired guy, talking about the plan. The hero smiled faintly, thinking that he had one person in mind with dynamite. The blue-haired guy thought that apparently he was going to use it again. Lloyd noted that this was one of the key moments of the story, Night of Iron and Blood. A purple barrier towered over the city. Cheyenne noted that this was Naram. People looked at the purple barrier in terror. The protagonist remarked that this was a city trapped inside a magical shield, and thousands of refugees were locked inside the city, whom Xavier had to rescue. The swordsman watched in horror. Floyd noted that by that time, Xavier had almost become a master of the sword, and Mana Heart had the fourth mana ring, and he helplessly watched as his mana was drained from the hearts of the captives. The swordsman bared his teeth, swinging his blade. He declared that he must save them, even at the cost of his life. The protagonist noted that in this way he, without realizing it, created a deadly skill. A blue energy sphere appeared in space. Xavier stated that it was necessary to protect Mana's main heart with one ring and the other 3 rings. An energy blast occurred in space. Xavier noted that a strike would follow. The swordsman put his hand with the blade in front of him. He used the explosion scale. A fireball appeared from the guy. The fireball made a hole in the purple barrier above the city. The barrier began to fade. The main character, with a stern face, smiled broadly, asking if they could not use such a skill. The swordsman looked at the character in confusion, asking how he knew this theory. The brown-haired guy said that he truly had this idea for the first time, and that he should look into his eyes and ask him what he thinks he's lying about. The protagonist was twirling a strand of hair around his finger. The swordsman said that he was right, and his eyes were terribly irritating, and he saw deceit in them. Lloyd asked if he didn't trust him, then smiled broadly, spreading his arms out to the sides. He said to just try, and he hoped that Xavier's ability would only grow from this. The blue-haired guy noted that he knew that he would still do it his way. Lloyd asked what he was talking about, suggesting that they always wish each other only the best. The protagonist looked at the swordsman's back with a cunning grin. Z said that if the theory was correct, then he would only profit from it. Lloyd thought that if he succeeded, he would also make every effort. The swordsman put the weapon in front of him, thinking that he needed to guard the heart of the mana with 1 ring and the other 3 rings. Xavier plunged his blade into the rock, noting that he needed to release it. A bright light appeared from the rock. The protagonist watched what was happening in confusion, wondering if this was a success on the first try. Clouds of smoke rose, among which a dark silhouette of a guy was visible. From the clouds of smoke, Xavier appeared with torn clothes. The swordsman looked at the protagonist with annoyance, asking if he had planned everything on purpose. The brown-haired man noted that he had not at all, and he was sorry that it had turned out this way. The swordsman sighed heavily, putting the blade back in its sheath. He said that in any case this time his idea worked, and now it was his turn. The system announced that Xavier was thankful for the lesson, and the sympathy level with Xavier had increased by +3. The system announced that the sympathy level was -11. The system announced that he had earned 54 RP for improving relations with key characters and a total RP of 561. The swordsman turned his back to the protagonist. He said that he knew that he was a knight and his skills should be used to protect the Baron, but he was using them in construction. The brown-haired man grinned wickedly, saying that he did not need tricks. The knight looked back at the brown-haired man with a cold gaze, saying that he was not thankful at all. Lloyd noted that the building project had been progressing quickly since then. A huge padong stood next to the protagonist. The protagonist noted that the granite that Xavier had split and shaped had been delivered to the construction site. The man looked at the orc with confusion, who waved his hand. The orc told the man that he would only hurt his back like that, and he would show him how it should be done. The men watched as the orcs carried stones. The protagonist said that he did not even ask them to do this, but the orcs, hooked on training, did all the work themselves. The orcs said that this was like regular practice, and now it was necessary to let it go. The protagonist watched with interest what was happening, thinking that at this rate they would finish the construction 5 times faster. Lloyd looked ahead with a serious expression, noting that now they only needed ice and insulation. Xavier stood next to the protagonist. Lloyd asked the knight if he had sent workers for insulation material and that it was a long time ago. The swordsman noted that exactly 3 weeks had passed. The protagonist looked at the knight with caution, asking if it was time for them to return already. The swordsman turned his gaze to the brown-haired man, noting that there were two possible options. Either the soldiers were too idle, or something had happened to them. The protagonist frowned, saying that something had gone wrong, after which he stood up, saying that they needed to find out everything. Xavier put his hand in front of the main character. He looked at the brown-haired man with a serious expression and said that if the task was to take place, then he would go alone, and he did not know exactly what could have happened and thought that he should not go. The brown-haired man squinted at the knight, asking if they had already discussed this. The protagonist put his hand to his side, noting that he was in charge of the construction and was responsible for the workers. Xavier closed his eyes and sighed heavily. Lloyd said that it was time to go. White clouds floated over the deserted cliffs. A glove lay in the middle of the road. The protagonist leaned toward the glove, picking it up. He noted that these were the gloves he ordered for insulation work. Xavier squinted and looked away, calling out to the protagonist. The guys were standing on the edge of a cliff. Xavier said that there was some kind of odd atmosphere in this gorge. Lloyd asked how odd it was. The brown-haired man looked at the knight in confusion. The swordsman said that the flow of mana there was quite unusual, and there was no clarity since everything was hazy. Lloyd wondered what was hazy and what kind of gorge this was. The protagonist looked ahead thoughtfully, noting that he had seen something like this on the pages of the story, Knight of Iron and Blood. After that, he looked ahead, stunned. The main character abruptly went the other way, telling Xavier that they were leaving and that they had little time. The knight asked what he had found. The brown-haired man looked ahead with a scared expression, declaring that their soldiers might no longer be alive. Xavier looked at the protagonist in horror. White clouds floated above the rocks the protagonist stood on. He was on the ground in front of the straw, after which he bent over to it, picking it up in his hand. Lloyd gripped the straw tightly in his palm. The boys neared the cave. The protagonist observed that this was the custom, and George, the boys, stared at the cave with a stern expression. The brown-haired boy remarked that at the very start of the story, this place was noted as one of Xavier's aims, and the dark wizard Ruffin was hiding there. Lloyd pondered how he dared to harm their fighters. Brown-haired Herod's face twisted into an angry scowl. He questioned if entering private land was considered a wrong. The knight entered the cave, grasping his sword. He told the leader to follow him. Lloyd asked them to wait for him. Xavier stepped onto the magic circle with his boot. The protagonist seized the swordsman by the jacket, pulling him toward himself. An explosion happened in front of the boys. They stood with their backs to the gap in the ground. The knight asked if it was a magic snare. The protagonist looked at the boy in confusion, asking if he was certain he was a knight, noting that he should predict such moments beforehand. Lloyd pictured the image of an injured Xavier. He thought that in the story, Xavier fell into the same snare when he was hurt and seeking shelter. The knight slightly parted his lips, after which he continued his path through the cave. Lloyd remarked that their Xavier never repeats mistakes. The brown-haired man pointed his finger to the side, asking what he meant, saying that the stream of mana there was odd. I suggest using my method there too. The swordsman shut his eyes and spread his arms outward. The protagonist stated that in a natural setting, mana has a steady density in the air. Blue specks of mana were drifting in space. The hero said that this way he could figure out where the magical snares were. The blue energy specks linked with each other. Lloyd noted that he sensed an unusual amount of mana. Xavier looked forward with a serious expression. The protagonist followed the knight with a grin. The blue-haired boy said that they should head there. The protagonist noted that his instincts were sharply honed. The swordsman glanced away, thinking that he only tells lies and persists, but now things were different. The protagonist slung the shovel over his shoulder, trailing the swordsman. Xavier wondered what was happening, adding that he foresees events before they occur. The swordsman kept following the path, wondering why he didn't feel any special power. But could it be such a strong mana? The blue-haired boy pressed his lips, thinking that first they needed to uncover what lay ahead. The boys continued their journey through the cave. The swordsman stated that they needed to rescue the captives as fast as possible. In the cave stood a man in black robes with a hood over his head, after which he glanced back with a stern expression. The boy stood near a table with books. He wondered if the snare had worked and someone had come to them and who it could be. The man slammed the book closed, saying that he would find out soon, after which he approached the door, noting that he believed his preparations were finished. The man moved the lock on the door, thinking that his test would succeed. There were tied men in a locked room. The boy said he hoped the wizard would pull the man out of the room by his hair who pleaded for mercy. Then he tossed the man into a magic circle. The wizard picked up a scythe, looking ahead with a frightening expression. He said that this was a magic circle that linked with hell, in the cruel side of the Reaper, waiting for its moment for 100 days in a container with blood and a young life. The wizard swung his scythe, saying that it was ideal. The man closed his eyes, yelling loudly. The protagonist shouted to the boy in the robe. The boy glanced back with a wild expression. The brown-haired man glared at the boy with a furious expression, telling him not to touch him. Ruffin raised his hand in front of himself, forming a magic circle. He asked if they were mad people, wondering how they avoided all the snares. The boys stood in front of Ruffin, after which a wall appeared in front of them. A wall soon appeared behind the boys. The protagonist opened his mouth wide, taking a breath. Lloyd stood with his cheeks puffed out. The boys were ready for a fight. Ruffin grinned wickedly, thinking that he would make them sleep with magic and then settle the score. The protagonist's eyes began to shine green. He thought that he was an energetic boy. The system notified him that he would not feel weary for 10 minutes. The brown-haired man began to fiercely dig the ground, thinking that a few minutes would be enough for him, because now he was no longer in a narrow tunnel. Xavier began to rub his eyes. Lloyd noted that Xavier had never taken medicine for sleeplessness, so no sleeping pill would affect him. The protagonist dug a hole in the ground, noting that he had already gone too far. The knight looked down with a stern expression, thinking that he resembled a mole, and when the chance came, he would chuckle at it. The protagonist began to point his finger at the knight, thinking that he should quickly go there. The swordsman stood in the tunnel, swinging his blade. Energy appeared around the sword. The knight thrust his blade into the wall. He used the blast skill. A pillar of fire appeared in front of the wizard, after which he fell to the ground in fear. Watching what was happening, a huge hole appeared in the ground. The protagonist's hand rose from the hole. Lloyd began to climb from the tunnel. He fell out of the hole, glaring at the wizard with a terrifying expression, saying that he had never seen such a giant beast before. Ruffin bared his teeth, creating magic circles, thinking that he had never seen such a giant beast. The wizard pressed his hands to the ground, forming a huge magic circle. A massive monster with 2 heads appeared behind the wizard. The man smiled crazily, thinking that even though his test had failed, this was his strongest creation. A huge, scary monster stood before the boys. The wizard thought that they should at least try to dent his steel armor. The protagonist looked away in confusion, saying that they would have a tough time with his weak legs. Lloyd glanced at Xavier in confusion, who leaped into the air. The swordsman delivered a fiery slashing strike to the monster, using the skill-tearing wave. Xavier sliced the monster in half. Ruffin watched in horror. The protagonist's eyes widened in shock. He wondered if he could use the power of the blast as a supporting force and cut in half. Xavier leaned slightly, putting his weapon back in its sheath. Lloyd wondered why the story didn't mention this move. The boys stood in a proud stance. The mage looked at the guys with fear, thinking that he was in danger and no matter what he did, he would not be able to beat them. The hero squatted down next to the man. He stared at the mage with a scary look, saying that he had taken their soldiers and now their building work had stopped because of him, asking how he was going to pay him. Ruffin bowed before the hero, thinking that it would be better for him to lie down on the ground for now because he had to survive by any means. The mage said that he had done a great wrong and was begging for mercy. Lloyd noted that he should not say that, and he was asking about payment for the harm caused. The man looked ahead with fear, saying that there were many precious things there and he would give them everything. The hero grinned slightly, asking if this was true and therefore it was all his. The man said that of course he could take everything. Xavier pulled the worker out of the room by the arm, telling the master that the soldiers were very tired, but their lives were not in danger. Lloyd said that was great and he was glad to hear it. The hero looked at the mage with a cold gaze, saying that in a couple of days they would have been dead, asking what he was going to do with them. The mage showed his teeth, saying that he was doing experiments, trying to find out how to bring the dead back to life. The hero looked at the man with scorn, asking if that was even possible and why he needed to know. The man narrowed his eyes. He continued to sit, bowing in front of the hero. Ruffin stated that it was to bring back his wife and son. The hero looked at the mage with a serious look. Ruffin remembered how he held his son in his arms with a smile and looked at his wife. He said that he was a mage in the house of a baron and lived a normal life with his family, and not just a normal one. He was joyful. Ruffin imagined the baron holding out his hand, and then the happy picture broke. He said that the baron he served suddenly wanted to take his wife away from him, so he tried to escape with them. The hero closed his eyes, opening his mouth wide. Ruffin said that the Baron was chasing them. Lloyd told him to stop and that he was good at carving. He looked at the mage with a serious look, asking what it meant. If he saved his wife and son, they would thank him for killing hundreds of innocent lives and saving them, and that he thought they would thank him like that. The man looked at the hero with confusion. The brown-haired man noted that the ghouls he created, the hero, looked at the man with a cold look. He asked if the lives of the people he sacrificed, their families, their joy, and for him it all meant nothing, adding that he did not think that his story deserved pity. Xavier watched the events with a serious look. The brown-haired man told him not to speak. His true nature cannot be changed. He looked down with a sad look. The brown-haired man noted that he had ruined the joy of so many families, and he would forever remain a killer. Tears began to flow from the mage's eyes. The hero pressed his lips together. He rose to his feet, saying that he would return later with help and take all of his magical items. The hero turned his back to the man, noting that if he tried to hurt anyone else, he should not expect mercy. The mage looked at the hero in shock, after which he bowed before the hero again, thanking him. Lloyd stood with his back to him, pressing his lips together. He imagined the image of the swordsman behind the mage. Lloyd noted that in the novel, Xavier forgave Ruffin and left the cave. The hero pictured the image of the scarred mage, noting that Ruffin then killed hundreds more innocent people and tested on himself, and he turned into an uncontrollable and bothersome villain who challenged Xavier again and again. Lloyd took a step, noting that even though he knew about it, he now turned his back on him because the mage's face was hidden under the hood. Ruffin peered out from under the hood with a scary look. Lloyd stood with his back to the man. The mage opened his mouth wide, creating a magic circle. He approached the hero with a mad smile, preparing to attack him. Lloyd looked behind him, staring at the mage with a frightening look. He asked the man if he had ever forgiven him. Ruffin looked at the hero in confusion. The brown-haired man thought that he knew from the very start what this would lead to. Xavier attacked the mage, cutting off his head. Ruffin's head bounced off the air. The man in the work uniform looked ahead with anger. He told the guy that he was nothing but trash, rotten to the core, and when he greeted him, he should bow 90 degrees, asking if he understood. The hero noted that there was a dude who constantly cursed for no reason. Lloyd remembered himself in his real world when he nervously looked ahead. He noted that it happened every damn time. The brunette bowed to the man, apologizing to him, noting that he would be more careful in the future. The worker told him to keep his back straight. Lloyd noted that there was nothing wrong with that. One should avoid fights, as one fight leads to another. The man turned his back to the guy, saying that the youth of their day have to be taught everything, and all they themselves know how to do is eat. The hero noted that if he was polite, then he would change. With such thoughts, he tried to put up with the situation. A beautiful orange sunset was visible in the sky. Lloyd asked what this led to. The brunette bowed to the man, greeting him. The guy stood motionless in a bent position. The man asked what he was at the demonstration, noting that he almost went deaf. The hero noted that he saw him as a punching bag. The man turned his back on the guy, saying how pathetic he was. Lloyd gritted his teeth, thinking that he needed to hold on and it would all be over soon. The guy showed his teeth, thinking that he needed to restrain himself, and if he made a scene, he would only suffer more, and he needed to calm down. The worker stood with his back to the guy, saying that only a worthless mother could have such a worthless son. The hero widened his eyes in rage. The guy put his hand on the man's shoulder, after which he showed his teeth and swung his fist. The brunette hit the man in the face. The workers looked back, watching what was happening, not understanding what had happened. Lloyd punched the man in the face, after which he hit him again. The brunette kicked the man in the stomach. He noted that while he was hitting him, there was only one thought in his head, that he was doomed. The workers ran up to the guy, stopping him. The guy was carrying pipes on his shoulder. Lloyd asked what the result was. The guy looked ahead in surprise. The man looked at the hero with fear, then he turned his head to the side. The brunette stood motionless, looking at the man leaving. The hero noted that peace had come. The hero turned his back to the dead body of the magician. He noted that sometimes he should stop any violence, wondering if everything would be okay then. The hero recalled the news on TV. He noted that there were a lot of serial killers and rapists in Korea, wondering why the most evil criminals escaped punishment, and perhaps it was all about human rights. Ruffin's head was lying on the ground. Lloyd thought it was funny, but then the villain should get what he deserved. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. The guys were strolling along the path in the forest. The man was hauling a backpack on his back with a tired look. The hero glanced back. The worker stared at the young gentleman in shock. The brown-haired man told him to hand over his load before he fell. The man started to decline the offer. The hero squinted, saying that if he felt ill, he would have to carry both of them, so he should give it to him fast. The sun's rays were piercing through the trees. The young master said that all the men should quickly pass him their backpacks, stating that this was a command. The workers gazed at the young master in confusion, saying that they would bear them themselves, and how could such a noble man do this? The hero tossed the backpacks on his back, saying that whoever was the most bothersome would not get extra pay. Tears appeared in the worker's eyes. Xavier watched what was happening in puzzlement, thinking that he did not know whether they packed the backpacks themselves or that he was truly worried about the well-being of the soldiers, and he did not understand him at all. The soldiers looked at the young master with moved expressions. The knight thought that the truth was not important to the soldiers now. Lloyd carried the backpacks with a stern look. The swordsman thought that a leader they could trust and follow. That's what the soldiers thought of young Master Lloyd. The system announced that the freed soldiers were deeply touched by his actions, and after some time, tales about him would be shared by word of mouth. The hero pursed his lips. The system asked if it wasn't wonderful. The hero looked ahead grumpily, asking what was wonderful, noting that he didn't need anything except cash. The weather was clear above the orc tribe. The iron doors to the stone cold storage were open. Haraj looked around the room with interest, saying that this was the cold storage. The chieftain's son looked up nervously. He glanced behind him, saying that it was only slightly cooler there than outside, and the meat would soon rot, and their muscles would lose their past strength. Lloyd said that it was only for now, and that was clear. The hero grinned widely, noting that it was because there was no ice, and they weren't finished yet. The chieftain's son stared at the young master in confusion, saying that he knew what ice was, and it was warm there, so there was no ice there. The brown-haired man beamed widely, saying that if not, they could create it themselves. Harak frowned in puzzlement, looking at the brown-haired man, asking how. The young master continued to smile, saying that whatever. Harak looked at the hero wearily. The brown-haired man kept forcing a smile onto his face. The orc narrowed his eyes, wondering if he had brought home a trickster and maybe the story about the queen was a fib. The hero smirked slightly. The system notified that Harak was not as foolish as he thought. Lloyd told the system to